The story, enigma, pursuit, unraveling. It's funny how some things can plague you from childhood through your adult years. Not big things, but little things which don't exactly persist, but annoyingly stick their head through your life's door and say boo, just to let you know they're still there. If I made a list of all these things in my life, it might take up a whole book. I'd like to talk about just one of these bugaboos. From the first time I heard this story of the creation in Adam and Eve, it buzzed me, as my young son would say. Now to me, the answer was not simply one of two usual alternatives, either unquestioning faith in the story as it stands, or complete repudiation as utter nonsense. No, the answer seemed to lie elsewhere. If the story were taught as the truth so uniformly, in spite of its apparent divergence from scientific truths, then to me the true course would seem to be a search for the foundation of the story, which would then lead to a true reading of it. The pursuit happened almost by accident. Years of data correlation and studying the Earth tumbling concept has shown the last tumble to have occurred about 6,500 years ago. That Noah, or Utnapishtim, or whatever his name was, did exist and did survive that particular cataclysm. A friend of mine suggested that Genesis 1 is almost a perfect description of conditions on our planet immediately following a tumble. On rereading it, I had to agree. Genesis 2 even mentions that a mist or flood went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. Well now, this was worth thinking about. If it were so, then it would be the tumble preceding Noah's, another fascinating story, about 11,500 years ago. This, then, could be approximately the time of the Adam and Eve story. The pursuit started. If the story did originate with that tumble, in what language was it first written? Certainly not Hebrew or Greek, for as far as we know, they did not exist at that time. If we look to men such as Don Antonio Batres Jaraqui and James Churchward, we may have our answer. Certainly their knowledge of prehistoric languages could be a key, and later we'll discuss the role of Naga and ancient Mayan in the story of Adam and Eve. First, however, let's examine the history of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. There are many schools of thought on this subject, but the most predominant one is that Moses was the originator. This seems not too far-fetched, since Moses was reared in the Egyptian tradition in a royal household, and probably had access to many religious writings and teachings now lost with the passing of the archives of Egypt in Alexandria, Heliopolis, and Sais. Certainly the 10 Commandments were a condensation of the 42 questions of Osiris for entering heaven. If Moses did write part of the Old Testament, he then must have had Naga tablet writings, or Egyptian interpretations of them handed down to the Egyptians for thousands of years, and the Egyptian priesthood had knowledge of a cataclysm 11,500 years ago. Priests of Egypt are supposed to have told Solon during his 10 years in Egypt, about 600 BC, that 9,000 years before that time, there was a cataclysm which buried Atlantis beneath the ocean. Note that 9,000 plus 600 BC plus 1950 AD equals 11,550 years ago. Moses' brother Aaron became the first chief priest of the Hebrews about 1300 BC. Somewhere between 15 and 18 generations later, the chief priesthood having been handed down father-son through the generations, Sariah, or Sarius, was the chief priest. See Ezra and 1 and 2 Esdras. In 586 BC, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Sariah was taken and executed, and his son Ezra made a captive in Persia. See 2 Kings. At that time, Jerusalem was sacked, and all Hebrew records, including their laws and records of the Old Testament, were burned with the temple at Jerusalem by Nebuzaradan, Nebuchadnezzar's captain of the guard. In 458 BC, during the 7th year of Artaxerxes I's reign in Persia, Ezra was commissioned to re-establish the Hebrew religion and law. According to 2 Esdras, Ezra rewrote the history of the Hebrews from the beginning and re-established their laws. Now, from 586 to 458 BC is 128 years. The latest that Ezra could have been born was after his father Sariah's murder. as well could be, see Onan's story, Genesis 38, 8-10. Therefore, the youngest he could have been in 458 BC was 127. He was working on a long memory. Let's examine this anomaly. As mentioned before, the lineage from Aaron to Ezra contains from 17 to 20 generations, including Aaron and Ezra. Assuming 1300 BC for the start of Aaron's priesthood, 1290 BC is adjudged the time of the Exodus, 458 BC to be near the end of Ezra's priesthood, then we find the average priesthood term per generation to be between 42.1 and 49.5 years. In view of this, can we believe that Ezra served his priesthood for approximately 130 years? It would appear much more plausible to assume that it was Ezra's grandfather, Azariah, rather than his father, Sariah, who was the one taken and executed by Nebuchadnezzar's men in 586 BC. Then Sariah and Ezra would have served as chief priests during the 128 years from 586 to 458 BC, for an average of 64 years apiece. It is even plausible that Ezra's great-grandfather, Hilkiah, could have been the victim in 586 BC, leaving Azariah, Sariah, and Ezra to serve the 128 years for an average of 42 years each, which is even closer to the overall average from Aaron to Ezra, over a period of about 845 years. This means that the Adam and Eve story was last seen in writing by Hilkiah or Azariah, therefore handed down verbally possibly by Azariah, and certainly by Sariah and Ezra, and finally dictated by Ezra to 5 scribes. It is the 5 scribes' writings that we have today as Ezra's work. And the English is not even a literal translation. For instance, without form and void, more literally would read, raging inundations and horrendous winds. Now, through Ezra's reconstruction of Genesis, we are told many things. Because of the usage of tree, fruit, serpent, cherubim, and other words which were glyphs in the picture language of prehistory, it is evident that the creation and Adam and Eve stories were probably originally written in the glyphs of Naga, the predominant Eastern Hemisphere language of 11,500 years ago. This language is nearly identical to ancient Mayan and the progenitor of many languages, including Oriental and Polynesian tongues, Egyptian, Greek, and Yakut. Moses and possibly Aaron may have had access to these tablets or Egyptian versions of them. Neither Moses nor Aaron knew how to read the ancient language, therefore read the glyphs quite literally. Not being able to read the symbolism of Naga glyphs in addition to reading them literally, Moses and Aaron, and possibly Ezra, read into the Adam and Eve story the social and religious attitudes of their day. In that time, woman was regarded as the root of all sin, a lowly creature. Her birth recorded only as an exception and basically being the cause of man's every downfall, a daily potential. This attitude persists in some religions even to our time. Is it any wonder that Eve was shouldered with the responsibility for the downfall of all mankind as a result of interpretations read into the Naga by Moses, and into Moses' reading by Ezra? Perhaps also it was read into the story by Egyptian priests long before Moses' time and passed on to him as history. The fusing of 2 stories, P and J versions, into one to make the story of Genesis 1, 2, and 3 may confuse the man with Adam. It is possible that Adam, being only 9 generations ahead of Noah, with the time span of the Sudan Basin polar era covering 5,000 years, was not the man referred to in the creation, but his name and later experiences were merged with the man's story. Remember, however, we are informed that Ezra dictated the entire history to 5 scribes from memory, and this work contains Genesis as we know it today. For him to recall from the archives of his mind what he did, as well as he did, certainly bespeaks of inspiration of a high order, but it also appears evident that he had no knowledge of the fact that 5,000 years transpired between Genesis 1 and Noah's flood. It is clear from 2 Ezra 3:9 that Genesis 1 and Noah's flood represented two inundations. However, for while speaking of the two occasions, he says of Noah's flood, "And again in process of time thou broughtest the flood upon those that dwelt in the world, and destroyest them." Now, we mentioned before that the lineage of the high priest from Aaron to Ezra differs in number of generations, 17 or 20, and names as presented in 1st and 2nd Esdras, and both differ in names from the book of Ezra. We also find differences in the lineages from Noah to Jesus, approximately 51 generations, in the Bible. Is it any wonder, therefore, that some generations could have been omitted in the Adam to Noah line, and the Aaron to Ezra line? And in the light of the fact that, in addition to overwhelming scientific evidence, there are countless legends in the Asia-Pacific area handed down from the inundation of 11,500 years ago of a creation much like that of Genesis 1 and 2, is it not possible that the man of the Genesis story became confused with Adam throughout the thousands of years, and through a succeeding tumble and inundation in Noah's time 6,500 years ago? The miracle actually is that the whole story of creation and of Adam and Eve is as undistorted as it is. Being 11,005 years old, it has suffered through many debacles visited upon its guardians in the intervening years. Because of the lack of resolving information, the man and Adam are kept as one in this translation interpretation. The significant Naga glyphs given to us by Ezra through Moses' direct reading are cherubims, rib, Adam's sleep, man, woman, tree, fruit, serpent, flaming sword. Our knowledge of Naga glyphs tells us that the tree of life symbolized a mother continent, a parent civilization lasting thousands of years longer than ours of today. An unadorned serpent represented water or the ocean. A serpent entwined about the tree signified that the mother continent was surrounded by water. Genesis 3:15 actually describes Eve's heel on the serpent's head, showing her victory over the oceans. Cherubims, which were not pretty, plump babies, but hybrid man and beast, were the glyphs for legs, or foundations or underpinnings. Instead of being placed in the Garden of Eden, one was taken away, and a Naga or Maya reading of the Egyptian Book of the Dead shows that cherubims of the north, east, south, and west were taken away, meaning that the foundations of the mother continent in all directions were removed or destroyed. The flaming sword was the symbol of fire and earthquake. The fire signified what all legends of these cataclysms call earth fire, which is the molten layer below the Earth's 60-mile thick shell, breaking through to the surface during a tumble, a literal hell. It is most probably the origin of man's concept of hell, as a matter of fact. Now back to the tree. Fruit growing on that tree symbolized the original mankind, which settled the mother continent ages before Adam and Eve. Their eating of the fruit tells us that they were descended from this original mankind of the continent. Eve eating first signifies that she was the generation after Adam, making her his daughter. His daughter? The glyph of the creation is even more revealing. There are three figures represented in this picture. The top figure is the face of a sleeping or dead person. There were no separate symbols for death and sleep in Naga. Both were represented as the same. The middle figure is shown as a male, and the bottom figure a female who is represented as the mother of all mankind. In addition, there are curved lines from the sleeping or dead person and the male middle figure to the bottom female figure. This glyph has been interpreted to mean that the middle figure, a male, was put to sleep, shown by the top figure, and a rib or ribs removed from him, the ribs being the curved lines, and fashioned into the bottom figure, the female mother of all mankind. This fits beautifully with the story of Eve's creation, Adam therefore being both the male middle figure and the top figure, a sleeping or dead person. There is a slight hitch to this story, however. The top figure, whether sleeping or dead, is depicted as a female. How could it be Adam, asleep, awake, dead, or alive? Moreover, in Naga, the curved lines denote parentage rather than ribs. So more reasonably, it appears that the top figure is a dead female whose offspring by the male middle figure, Adam, was the bottom female figure, Eve, the mother of the Hebrews. So in essence, the story, as read from the glyphs, would be that Adam and Eve, who lived in the Garden of Eden in the mother continent, tree, were descended from the original mankind, fruit, of that land, which incidentally was surrounded entirely by water, serpent around the tree. Eve was Adam's daughter, and he was a widower. They realized that in order to survive, they had to leave and never try to return, for the motherland was to be destroyed by a cataclysmic inundation. They left, and afterward the continent, tree, was subjected to a fiery earthquake, flaming sword, during which it lost its foundations, cherubims, and sank beneath the ocean, serpent, which forever afterward walked over the sunken continent on its belly. So let's review the event 2 cataclysms ago, and then apply our knowledge toward a representative translation interpretation of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. It may be the most accurate reading of a story written 11,500 years ago. Please remember to hit the like button and do subscribe so that you won't miss any future uploads of knowledge and incredible audiobooks. And I'm your host, RC Story, and I appreciate your support. Please look out for part 3 of this Adam and Eve trilogy.